Tradition's an interesting word because they go back, and they're certainly in Belgium back farther than we are. But I think, as we've seen, history isn't as accurately recorded as we'd like to believe it. And people want to say, like think about India Pale Ales or the Three Threads. They're not really as historical as we think they are. So, or now we know, but it is a tradition, and I love them, and I keep saying I'm going to go back and make another visit. Maybe I will this fall because I do miss it so. But quite frankly, I also miss London and going to see some friends over there. So to some extent, we're Americans, and we make our own traditions, and we learn, and we're doing it. And I think the Careys and the lovely what they've done out there in Wisconsin is wonderful. And they're saying, okay, we base it on a tradition, but now this is how we're doing. And I think a lot of American brewers, even if you're basing it, at some point you go, okay, but now this is what we do, and it's not necessarily Belgian. It's Wisconsin in that case. It's Wisconsin now, or it's Niles, Illinois now, or it's Fort Wayne, Indiana now. It's what we do.
That's Jeff Sparrow, author of the influential 2005 book Wild Brews. In it, he revealed a remnant of an old tradition, when brewers encourage wild yeast and bacteria to ferment their beer, giving them enormous depth and character. In the rest of the world, brewers had spent more than a century trying to get wild yeasts out of their breweries, and those making Lambic, Flemish Rudbrun, and Berliner Weisse were steadily dwindling. A few Americans were transfixed by reports of these wild ales, and they started visiting Belgium to learn their secrets. One of the first and most influential beers to emerge from this period is the subject of today's episode of One Iconic Beer. In 1993, Deb and Dan Carey released Wisconsin Belgian Red, the third beer they made at their new brewery, New Glarus. It was one of the country's first sour ales, and it was very influential, and not just because it was so unusual. The Careys weren't on a momentary flight of fancy. Rather, Dan Carey, the brewer, had been experimenting with wild ales for 6 years, and they intended Wisconsin Belgian Red to be a key part of their portfolio. 33 years later, it still is. On today's episode, we're going to hear from Jeff Sparrow and Dan Carey about how these old, almost extinct methods jumped the ocean to the United States to become an enduring part of craft brewing. No beer was more critical in developing interest in wild ales than New Glarus Wisconsin Belgian Red, and this is its story. This podcast is hosted by All About Beer and myself, Jeff Allworth. I'm a writer and the author of books like The Beer Bible and The Secrets of Master Brewers. All About Beer magazine was founded nearly 50 years ago and is the most comprehensive source for beer information on the internet. Go to allaboutbeer.com to find more podcasts, beer news, and a trove of insight and opinion. Before we get started, however, here's a word about the important partners who make this podcast possible.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brew house, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.
Well, in 86, when we were living in Eying, I had a few days off, and my wife and my daughters and we rented a car and we drove over to Belgium. And which of course is, not that far in the scheme of things for an American.
That's Dan Carey describing the informal education he received while apprenticing at a Bavarian brewery.
I went to Orval. I went to all of the iconic breweries because in those days, all of us brewers, we all had copies, of Michael Jackson's coffee table books about brewing, and I like probably like all of us, we would. I would page through it and look at these exotic and wonderful breweries in Europe that were far off and exotic and had all of these unique beers. And so using Michael Jackson as a guide, we visited breweries. And in those days, you could knock on the door at Pilsner Urquell or Lambic Brewery in Belgium or Orval, and someone would receive you because, of course, nowadays, people are not so keen on receiving American brewers because we have a tendency to copy what they're doing. But in those days, it was pretty exotic. And also having a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old daughter in tow and a wife, it kind of is disarming. So for me to show up in really really poor French or German to say, "Hey, I'm a brewer. Can I see your brewery?" And I went to Lindemans, which at that point, Lindemans now has their satellite brewery, which is huge and a beautiful, beautiful brewery. But in those days, it was Rennie Lindeman in his farm, working in a farm, literally. And so I knocked on his door. He answered it, and I said, "Hey, can I see your brewery?" And we basically spent the day together, and he showed me his oak tanks. He showed me how he made fruit beer. He showed me how he mashed. He showed me everything. And that was probably the starting point. I'd studied winemaking in addition to brewing in school, so I did have understanding of fruit, acidity, and the like. So it was relatively straightforward for me to start studying this. And I spent about 6 years trying to understand how to brew these types of beers, and I got to the point where I was making a beer that my wife said, "Well, this is pretty good. Maybe we should start a brewery." And so the impetus for New Glarus Brewery was in fact Belgian Red.
We should step back for a moment and talk about New Glarus. Deb and Dan founded the brewery in a small town of the same name, 25 miles south of Madison, Wisconsin. In the 3+ decades since, it has grown to become one of the largest craft breweries in the U.S. and Wisconsin's largest. The brewery famously only sells beer in Wisconsin, and its flagship ale, Spotted Cow, has become the latest in a long line of home state favorites. One of the brewery's incongruities is Carey's very conventional background, which on the surface didn't seem likely to produce one of America's first wild ales. He explains.
I've always been intrigued by beer. I grew up in the city of San Francisco, which is a brewing city. I mean, there was Hams and Lucky Lager, and of course Anchor. And my father drank Olympia, Oli. So even as far as back as I can remember, I've always loved the taste of beer. And probably when I was 13 or 14 in the early mid 70s, when I first tasted a taste of Anchor steam beer, I was blown away. And yeah, even when I was a kid, my family would take brewery tours and winery tours in Napa Valley, for example. So the alchemy of brewing has always been interesting to me. I went to UC Davis, University of California, Davis, and studied brewing under Michael Lewis. I wasn't sure what I was going to do at that point, so I took winemaking courses, and I took dairy science classes. And really, the only time I ever got an A+ in any course at UC Davis was in dairy science. So I could have easily been a cheesemaker. And when I graduated, I was tired of living in San Francisco, which at that time was, 7 miles by 7 miles enclosed with three sides on water, with about 800,000 people. And so I moved to Montana, which was, I think, the fourth largest state with about the same amount of people. The problem with San Francisco is there's one more car than there is parking places. So at least at that time, it was a little bit too crowded for me. And I went to work in a small brewery, Kessler Brewing Company in Helena, Montana. And that would have been in 1983. So I think we were probably the ninth craft brewery in the country at that time. So I built a small brewery, and I think we were making maybe 3,000 barrels of beer a year at that point. I worked there for some time, and then decided that although my UC Davis education was excellent, I could write the the TCA pathways and how lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid from sugar, but I really was not good at engineering and the technique of brewing. So I went to the Siebel Institute in Chicago at that time. It was a 13 week diploma course. My wife and I and two daughters packed up and moved to Chicago and found a month-to-month lease on an apartment, and I studied at UC Davis. I did well there, and then I went to Germany and worked in a small brewery near Munich, Eyinger Brewery, as an apprentice brewer, and I did that for some time, just dragging hoses and cleaning tanks and weighing out hops, and we were using whole cone hops in those days, and did that for a while, and then I worked for JB Northwest out your way. And built breweries. I was a project manager building breweries, and that was a really, really good education because I learned a lot about brewery engineering. So I had science, I had technical, and then I had also understanding of engineering. And at that point, I was a little bit discouraged by the craft brewing business. That was 1990, and at that time, you may remember that was kind of like now. It was a lull. It was not a good time. A lot of breweries were going out of business. And so I went to work for Anheuser-Busch. I did that for 3 years, working as a supervisor in a lot of different departments. And my wife is from Wisconsin, and she said, this corporate life is neither you or nor I are happy. So let's move back to my home, Wisconsin. I will build a brewery. She's an entrepreneur. She's owned businesses her whole life, and I'm a technician. I am not an entrepreneur. So we packed up and moved to Wisconsin and started New Glarus Brewery in '93, and the rest has been like I feel like I've been on a galloping horse, just desperately holding on to the saddle horn, trying not to fall off.
The traditional styles of wild ales made in Belgium and elsewhere were almost completely unknown in the United States. In fact, lambic, the most famous style, was incredibly obscure even in its native country. Before a renaissance buoyed by export sales in the 2000s, the entire country made fewer than 12,000 barrels of lambic. That's about the size of one modest U.S. craft brewery. A few intrepid Americans had heard about the tradition and gone to seek it out. In 1993, as Deb and Dan were relocating to Wisconsin, Jeff Sparrow also went on a Belgian adventure. He describes how people learned of these beers by word of mouth.
Yeah, don't want to make a long story too long, but we're in a local liquor store decades ago, and a friend of mine, he said, "Look, here's this cotillion beer that's flavored with raspberries." And I'm like, then brought it home, tried it, and learned to pronounce the name properly. And amazing beer, had nothing like it. And then went to Belgium in '93. Went to Europe in '93. And my friends wanted to skip Belgium altogether. I said, absolutely not. I've heard so much about them. And we visited Cantillon, and the man himself, Jean-Pierre, was there alone. A lot of people weren't visiting at that point. And every time we drank a beer, he'd pour us another one, and then came back and went, as I say, up the hill to Dreifonteinen and places in Beersel. And it was going to Indribonnen, which is now sadly closed. It was a place where they blended their own creek. That we learned how local these beers were, and just took off from there.
He also toured Brewery Bohn the same year the Careys launched New Glarus.
There was some beer thing at a place downtown, and we met the importer on Don Feinberg.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
anyone who wants to tour places in Belgium, let me know. We said, okay, here's where we want to go. And he's like, oh gosh, someone actually called me on this. He goes, well, I can get you a front bone, and we showed it with front bone. And look, again, I'm thinking back to 1993, and he looks probably slightly annoyed because I have to do this with these Americans who don't know shit, and we didn't. But we wanted to learn and we wanted to hear about it. And the tour wound up going a lot longer, I think, than he anticipated it would. He took us all on his then small, and if you think about his brewery now, this massive place, it was his house and his tiny little brewery next to it. Now there's still a house there. I've been back, I've been back since. It's a massive brewery now. Good for that, for being successful. And it was more just still like, this is where I live, what I do. And so, yeah, it was a tour. Like I look back now and I say, I can't believe that happened. But right place, right time. And if you'd said that would be the seeds to doing what I've managed to do with the book and Wild Brews and things, that's just kind of all fell into place. So thank you, Frank.
I've had the fortune of touring some of the great lambic breweries around Brussels, and they are remarkable. It's nearly impossible not to fall in love with the romance of the way they're made. Brewers use an old-fashioned, labor-intensive process to brew the beers. They run the wort off into a giant shallow pan called a coolship. As the wort cools overnight, it's inoculated with wild yeast and bacteria. Never in the process do brewers pitch additional yeast. Once the wort is cool, brewers put it into wooden vats, which are also laden with wild yeast and bacteria from earlier batches, and there the beer ferments and ripens for years. Translating that romance into actual drinkable beer is an entirely different matter. After his tour of Lindemans, Dan Carey returned to the U.S. to see if he could do it.
The brewing of, shall we say, lambic beer that you find around Brussels is very regimented, very controlled. But being in America and not being under those rules and not referring to our beer as a lambic, but being inspired by lambics, we were kind of free to go our own way. We did not have a cool ship in the early days, so what I used was the lauter tun as a cool ship. So we would boil and then I'd pump it back into the lauter tun. We clean the lauter tun. Well, shovel out the lauter tun and rinse it down, and then move the wort back over, open the manways, open the windows, and leave it overnight. And I certainly around Brussels, they're brewing in the wintertime. But in Wisconsin, we quickly found out, well, not quickly, it did take time to figure out that we're better off to brew in the shoulder seasons, meaning in the fall, in the late fall and the spring, because winter's just too cold. And then one thing that, in my opinion, that brewers talk about the cool ship, and the cool ship is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but we had a 50-year-old oak tanks from Rodney Strong Winery. So you can imagine that there was already a culture of various microorganisms in the wood that were endemic in the wood, because they're not lined. It's just the when the oak tanks arrived, they were patinaed that purpley red color and from the wine, and smelled like wine. And then also lactobacillus is endemic on malt. So you can imagine the lauter tun is probably already well inoculated with lactobacillus. And I think that allowed us to be relatively successful.
American breweries are set up to make so-called clean beer with domesticated laboratory yeast strains. In order to make wild beer, Carey had to implement some unorthodox practices.
Okay, well, so it's a good news, bad news story. In order to protect, what we did was, so we had oak tanks that came from the Rodney Strong Winery in Russian River. And we felt that was important. So we had a corner of the brewery that had two wooden tanks, foeders. I don't like that word because I'm not Dutch. Wooden tanks in the corner, and we had beer hoses and fittings and pumps, gaskets, all of the beer, all the stainless parts were spray painted orange, like hunter orange, and we the brewers called them our Ebola hoses. And so when we made sour beer, we would not brew anything else. We would be between yeast cultures, for example. So we would basically shut the brewery down, and we would make our sour beer. Once it got buttoned up into the oak tank, then we would baptize the whole brewery with bleach and start back up. But out of that, I have become, in my opinion, a really, really, really good microbiologist. Not as a lab tech, but one of the things that I always say to brewing microbiology professors is you guys teach everybody what the difference between a gram negative and a gram positive bacteria, et cetera, how to classify them, but you never teach them how to find contaminations. And I am like a bloodhound. If you tell me what bacteria you have, what the count is, and what kind of beer you're making, I could probably tell you where it's coming from because I've learned having made mistakes. So it's not without its danger in running the two together.
Because the majority of Careys beer were not going to be wild, the brewery had to develop protocols to keep the clean beer clean.
It's a good news, bad news story. In order to protect what we did was so we had oak tanks that came from the Rodney Strong winery in Russian River. And we felt that that was important. So we had a corner of the brewery that had two wooden tanks, foeders. I don't like that word because I'm not Dutch. Wooden tanks in the corner, and we had beer hoses and fittings and pumps, gaskets, all of the beer, all the stainless parts were spray painted orange, like hunter orange, and the brewers called them our Ebola hoses. And so when we made sour beer, we would not brew anything else. We would be between yeast cultures, for example. So we would basically shut the brewery down, and we would make our sour beer. Once it got buttoned up into the oak tank, then we would baptize the whole brewery with bleach and start back up. But out of that, I have become, in my opinion, a really, really, really good microbiologist. Not as a lab tech, but one of the things that I always say to brewing microbiology professors is you guys teach everybody what the difference between a gram negative and a gram positive bacteria, et cetera, how to classify them, but you never teach them how to find contaminations. And I am like a bloodhound. If you tell me what bacteria you have, what the count is, and what kind of beer you're making, I could probably tell you where it's coming from because I've learned having made mistakes. So it's not without its danger in running the two together.
Carey had been preparing to brew a wild ale for years, a project that came to fruition with Wisconsin Belgian Red. He describes it.
Yep, Belgian Red was first, and then Raspberry Tart came, I don't know, a year or two later after I tasted a draft version of Lindemann's Framboise. Well, I guess first of all, our raspberries come from Oregon. Red raspberries come from Oregon, and raspberries, as a side note, are fussy, and crop failures are common. So raspberries are obscenely expensive. But cherries, certainly there's cherries out your way, of course. But Michigan is known for its cherries, and the Door County Peninsula, which is a long, thin peninsula in the northeast of Wisconsin. That's, it's like a thumb. People always do that with Michigan, but this is Wisconsin, and it's the thumb here. So even though it's in the far north near Canada, near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, it's a moderate temperature. So there's been a long history of growing Montmorency cherries up there. We also brew a beer with Balaton cherries, but Belgian Red is 100% Montmorency cherries, which is a sour cherry, and it comes from the major orchard up there.
When it came out, people like Jeff Sparrow took notice.
So even back in the early days, he wanted to do this. And then and this, I don't remember it specifically. I do remember it happening. And then one day he did. He made the Belgian Red, and we're like, damn, he really did it. So it was kind of destiny. He was always going to do this, and of course he did.
Starting with Wisconsin Belgian Red made obvious sense. Thanks to Wisconsin's Door County, cherries are famous there. If he was going to make a very strange beer, Carey at least gave locals a lifeline of familiarity. The fruit made it more approachable as well because the sugars balanced the acidity. Here's Carey describing the beer.
Well, we make a whole range of sour beers from really really sour to dessert, sweet dessert beers. Belgian Red is, if you know Montmorency cherries, they are that iconic sour cherry flavor. The base beer, for this beer, for many, we make two base beers. We make a blonde beer and a brown beer. Some of our fruit beers are blonde based, more or less a Gouze, and then some are more of a sour brown, Flemish style sour brown beer. You could argue about all of the nuances that everybody gets into, but I don't. I think the Belgians find that humorous. It's a sour brown beer with heavy, heavy, heavy dose of Montmorency cherries.
Belgians make these beers very differently. Some of them are quite dry. Some of
Yeah.
them are funky, not
Yes.
not sour, but funky, and some are more
Yes.
sour and some kind of balance between all of that. When you're
Yes.
making these for an American audience, what was your target? What were you thinking would go?
Like a dessert beer, a sweeter beer that uh, if you look at fruit is, if you want to have the taste of fruit, it's the balance of, certainly you need the aroma of fruit, which is not so easy, but you also need the acidity of fruit and you need the sweetness of fruit. And when you have all three of those in balance, we are basically primates, and so we come out of the trees and we like fruit. I mean, it's just genetically encoded. Of course, acidity is hugely important, but there's more to it than that. And I think now we're starting to see that brewers are better understanding how to manipulate their process to make something that's harmonious, just like they are using hops in a delicate way to make a beer that's harmoniously bitter and drinkable, to make a sour beer. And that's my goal, is to I'm working really hard in our spontaneous beers to make them brighter, balanced acidity, um, some sweetness and some fruitiness. Because if you check the gravity, the present gravity, the residual extract in some of the iconic lambic beers, we think of lambic beers to be around 0 degrees Plato final attenuation. Some of them are actually 2.5 or 3 degrees Plato. So it's kind of shocking that balance is more important.
In the early 1990s, most Americans hadn't encountered craft beer yet, and if they had, it was something fairly sedate by today's standards. So how did customers relate to New Glarus's wild ales? Sparrow recalls his impression.
I mean, they were so unique, and we, at least down here, we have the Chicago Beer Society, who anything that was somewhat different, and we're like, this is pretty good. I mean, wow, someone actually did this. And yeah, if you're going to compare it to Cantillon, well, it's kind of not fair. A brewery that's been doing it for 100 years, and someone who's just starting, so you kind of had to give some leeway. But they were, I mean, at least we beer lovers here really enjoyed it.
Carey remembers the reaction as well.
Well, people were blown away. Certainly, Belgian Red is a big beer. It's not something that you're going to sit and drink 3 pints of. When we took it to beer festivals, whether it was GABF or a local Wisconsin festival, we'd always have really long lines because people would basically get a sample and then they go to the back of the line and then work their way up and just keep drinking that beer because I think it was so unique that people were. I mean, of course, now people have pretty much reverse engineered it and know how to make it. But in those days, it was kind of a one of a kind, unless you were drinking Lindemans or
Mhm.
Leafmans. Leafmans also made one.
It's the mid 1990s, and New Glarus is a fledgling brewery making a small amount of beer, including a very interesting wild ale. We'll hear what came next, but first, here's a message from our sponsors.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brewhouse, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great or even iconic pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.
Deb Carey thought that making an American version of a Belgian wild ale would be a nice way to attract attention. And it was. Yet the style of beer was so far outside the box, it took other breweries some time to catch up. I asked Carey to describe the slow, early development of wild ales in the U.S.
Oh boy. I guess it was pretty quiet for us. We were alone for some years, but then we started to see the Brewers Rat Pack, Vinny and all the guys from Allagash and whatever going over and meeting Jean Van Roy, and he kind of opened the door. He's been very, very kind to American craft brewers. He'll let us, I mean, with an introduction, and as long as because he's a strong personality, shall we say, but he'll allow, he's allowed me, he's allowed all of these guys to come and hang out at the brewery, watch him brew, ask any question you want. There's no secrets. And I think his reasoning was that lambic style beers were so unknown and so misunderstood that he wanted more people to be involved, so that the average person would understand. And number two, he wanted us to not make crappy beer and ruin the image of the beer. That's what I'm guessing. So I would say that probably in the early 2000s, there were brewers that started that were just going to make sour beers and embrace things like Brettanomyces. Some people would brew spontaneous beers. Some people would brew inoculated beers with the mixed cultures of various things. And then, of course, there were the labs that came up that supplied them. So I think little by little, through education, this is really before the internet was really that powerful. People started to move forward.
Sparrow also observed what was happening as brewers tried to figure out how to make these beers.
Well, that takes me back. I mean, it was really just learning. I mean, spontaneous came later. So people, you have the cultures from was then the bigger, Y East, and then White Labs got involved, and now there's so many more. but they got they I want to say they kind of cleaned things up. You took what was in barrels and you go, okay, these are the dominant strains. It's like what Wyeast did for the DuPont homebrew strain. They took what they thought was dominant, and well, it's a tough one to get to work because I think some of the things that you took out of it might have been important. So, and the newer companies come around and they put things back into it. But I've played around with some of those things as a lot of the bigger brewers did, and he made a lambic. And in the book, I decided not to wordsmith. It's like we're going to call it a lambic, even though it's not. It's something you're trying to achieve. And a lot of brewers tried to achieve it, and some got close and others didn't. And then people, okay, if I can't get there, what can I do? So I'm going to make something that has Brettanomyces characters, and I'm going to make something that is sourish, and people evolve from there.
No matter what approach brewers take, adding lab yeasts or spontaneously fermenting, wild ales are hard to make. As more brewers started making them, problems arose.
A lot of the spontaneous beer that was made in the early days was way, 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 way too sour. And I have a theory on why that is. And it's because some of the beer that was coming over here from Belgium was maybe not perfect beer, because in the late 90s, sour beers in Belgium were not very popular. So there was a lot of old beer in oak tanks starting to go acetic. And so the first time that American brewers drank beers from Belgium, they were probably more sour than, say, someone like Frank Bone would make, or even Cantillon would make, because and then being American, if 30 IBUs is good, then 100 IBUs is better. If half a percent acidity is good, then 1.5 is better. And so this was, and it was a time when brewers didn't really understand how to control acidity. So sometimes the beers were basically battery acid. So if you like my wife talks about, like Scoville units, like if you were a real man, then you would drink this and this and this or that sour beer, which would peel the enamel off your teeth, but 99.9% of people rejected it. And so I think that set back the whole idea of spontaneous beers until people started to really understand things like the bone beers, that they're called sour beers, but that's really not a good word. They're harmonious, just like you would never call a Chenin Blanc a sour wine.
As wild ales started to filter out into the brewing world, they created confusion and controversy. Should they be made completely traditionally, or were new methods acceptable? One of the big questions was what to call them. Jeff Sparrow settled on wild ales, but some people called them sour. Carey had a front row seat to this whole drama, and he reflected on it.
Well, I don't. I think in the end, the term sour beer is difficult, but relatively accurate. I would say maybe wild beers is probably a better term. Certainly, there are wild beers that are inoculated, and then there are spontaneous beers. But even spontaneous beers, I don't think any spontaneous beer brewer would say this, but we have cultures that are indigenous in the wood, and so I mean, certainly if we have a really, really good, to let in a little bit of a secret, which I probably shouldn't do, if we have a really good tank of beer and we empty it, I might leave a hectoliter or two behind when I top it with wort, because I'm got some really nice bugs growing in it. So it gets a little bit muddy. But when it comes to sour beer, I've often said to the powers that be at the Association of Brewers, I don't like your descriptions of these spontaneous beers or sour beers, because you don't give us a guidepost for what the acidity should be. And so therefore it gets very difficult, because I've been in around these tables at the beer competitions, and there'll be fights between the American brewers that have maybe there's a beer on the table that's acidic and really, really sour. And the Belgian judges will say, "Olé, monsieur, it's undrinkable. It's undrinkable." And the Americans would say, "No, it's perfect." And then I would look at the Association of Brewer people and say, "You need to define for us what the level of acidity needs to be for this beer style." Their response was, "Oh, acidity, that's difficult to measure." Oh, come on. Anybody who's made wine at home knows how to measure acidity. If you tell us it needs to be between 0.5 and 1% as lactic acid, I think anybody that knows anything about wine or sour beer knows exactly what that means. And frankly, to measure acidity is a heck of a lot easier than measuring bitterness units. So if anybody from the Association of Brewers is listening, you should include the level of acidity, and it would help us to better understand what you want in a beer. Do you want it to be 1.2% acidity, or do you want it to be 0.2%? It's a very, very different beer.
Eventually, the brewers themselves started sorting all this out.
Well, I mean, let's look at this. The traditions in Belgium are far-reaching. There's spontaneous, and then there's people who mess around and make lambic in less than traditional ways. And I don't want to criticize them. Um, and then there's people in Flanders, and I got a little bit of fluff for kind of comparing the beers. But as I sat down and finished the manuscript, I'm like, they really are similar, even if the methods are not. And what are you trying to achieve? And the people in Flanders are like, well, there's many arguments about where traditions came from, and I'm not sure we're ever going to really know the complete answers to it. There's a couple books on lambic after mine, not that talked about where that came from, and one of them speaks the language much better than I ever could, since I'm not a French or Flemish speaker. So, um, it's as much as I love the spontaneous beers, there's more than just that, and they're all lovely.
There is absolutely no reason experimental beers like Wisconsin Belgian Red should have survived 30 years, and yet New Glarus still makes it. In fact, the brewery and the beer grew up together. Carey describes how New Glarus and its wild program grew.
First of all, when we built the brewery, we bought a bottle filler from a small brewery in Bavaria, and I remember the brewery was 10,000 hectoliters, 8,000 barrels ish. And I thought, wow, that's huge. I said, we'll never be that big. I mean, that's crazy. I imagine we would sell 3,000 barrels and then eventually go out of business. So I never imagined that we would grow. We were sometimes in business. Business is certainly, it's certainly about hard work, getting up every morning and going to work, and being smart. But don't underestimate the value of luck, because sometimes people can have the first two and still fail. So you need some luck. And so for us, our brewery kept growing, and we got to the point where what we call our Riverside Brewery, where we made all of our beer, we reached about 65,000 barrels of beer, and we didn't really have any. It's on a floodplain, so we had nowhere else to go and to grow. Because you remember in those days, in the early 2000s, every brewery was growing 20, 30, 40, 50, 100% a year. So we opted to build a new brewery, a modern mini version of a large brewery, our Hilltop Brewery on the top of the hill on the other side of New Glarus. So that made basically our Riverside Brewery redundant. And that's where our oak tanks were. And the value, everything was built in place. The walls were built around the brew house. The idea of selling it just didn't sit well with us. And so we opted to make all of our specialty beers at the Riverside Brewery. So it gave us an opportunity And it was at that point that we started to contemplate really going in whole hog with sour beer. We built what we call our wild fruit cave, where we make now it's a separate building, which is nice because it's completely quarantined and it's built into the hill. And we have about 20 oak tanks, 50 hectoliters with 40 barrel tanks in there, and we have a small bottling line in there, so everything is contained in this room, and so we were able to continue making all kinds of sour beer in this building without fear of cross-contamination, without affecting Spotted Cow, which was made at a completely different facility.
Right. I'll confess that this broad category of wild ales is one of my very favorites. I've been around long enough that I recall those days when people weren't really sure if you could spontaneously ferment a beer outside of that small scrap of land near the Zen River. For American breweries trying to make those beers, the learning curve was intense. Over time, Americans did learn. They learned about mixed fermentation techniques, making a regular beer first and then adding wild yeast and bacteria. They learned about blending beer from different casks, about how to use fruit. Much as in Belgium, wild ales never became a mainstream beer. Far from it. But brewers in the US did master the style, and today those can be some of the most accomplished beers brewed by Americans. We owe a lot of this evolution to Wisconsin Belgian Red.
It grew, and then some people will say it contracted again. I'm happy people still do it. Um, so someone walked into my local brewery and had a bottle of goose from a place in Fort Wayne, Indiana called Two Tongues, and they showed me a picture, and it was a cool ship on end in the corner. And this man, I so wanted to go visit there, brings it down, and it's a real cool ship, and he puts word in it. And Wayne Percy, he said he sits there overnight and watches it. And I said, I could so do that. And it was just a lovely beer. And it was really 1, 2, 3-year-old spontaneous beer. So, and other people, they're going to make it simpler. Again, my local there, they keep the culture going in one tank. And sometimes it gets a little acidic and you kind of have to tame it a little bit. And other people just love your kettle sours. So it's more of, what do I want and what do my customers want? And that's fair enough, as long as you like it.
It was probably a good thing that a classically trained brewer was one of the first to experiment with the old traditions of brewing wild ales. Dan Carey brought a sense of order to a disorderly beer, and he stuck with it. Wild ales can never be truly tamed, which is their charm. But decades on, brewers have learned to work with them rather than against them. Here's a final thought from Dan Carey.
We have a whole range of sour beers from very sweet to very, very dry. And the problem for me to make a spontaneous beer is that we're not completely in control. And when I train a new brewer to work in our wild fruit cave, it's really uncomfortable for them because I remember I went to a brewery with Roger Moucha who's a Belgian brewing consultant, and he would go and he would taste the beer, and then he would drink it, and he'd throw it against the wall to inoculate the room. And as a Germanically classically trained brewer, it shocked the hell out of me. So it's a completely different way of thinking. And the analogy that I have is like it's a difference between having a manicured lawn and trying to grow a field of wildflowers. You want to use indigenous plants, but you don't want thistles to grow. You don't want acetic acid bacteria to grow. So you are coaxing the system one way or the other. How you hop, how you mash, the temperatures, the time of year, how full you fill the tanks. All of these things will coax the beer one way or the other. And since it's more or less like winemaking, a yearly process, unlike brewing, where if you're making an ale, you can every 2 weeks you can have a different permeation. When you're making a sour beer, you do something and then you don't know what it's like until 1, 2, 3, 5 years down the road. And that's why I think when you see Belgian sour beers, not so much now, but nobody wanted to change because If you start pulling levers when you're making sour beer, you won't know for 5 years whether it was the right thing or not. So if you're making something that you like, I say laminate that recipe and don't change, because it's just so easy to screw up.
My thanks to Dan Carey and Jeff Sparrow for joining us to tell this story. This show is produced by All About Beer and was edited by John Hall. Visit us online at allaboutbeer.com, where you'll find a trove of wonderful information about all things beery. And please follow us at All About Beer on social media. Our music was performed by Anastasia Chubarova, whom you can find on Pixabay. I'm Jeff Allworth. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one iconic beer.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brew house, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.